Hi everyone and welcome back. This is the part 2 video for my tutorial on making a Disney Animators Doll Easter dress. Here we're going to be making the apron and shoes to match. So jumping right into things, we're starting off with the apron. We're going to be taking the ruffle piece and we'll be folding it in half and then sewing a gathering stitch along the raw edge, which I somehow forgot to get a shot of this, but if you watched video part 1, you know what to do. Then once done, you can start to gather it. Then we're going to match up the center notch on the ruffle and the center notch on the apron piece and pin. Then match up the edges, placing another pin, and even out the gathers, pinning along the way. Then repeat on the other side, and once you're all done, you're going to sew. Once done, you can press the ruffle flat, and then lastly, we just need to add a gather stitch along the top of the apron, not including the ruffle. Now take your apron and the apron string, and I'm going to gather the apron a little bit to start. Now, the notches on the apron string, this is where the blue part of my apron is going to line up. This will just help you know how much to gather it. So match up those center notches and pin, and then match up the outer notch with the seam of the ruffle and the apron and pin there as well. Then if need be, straighten out the gathers between these points, and you're going to sew from the one edge of the apron to the other. Now we're going to press the apron string to prepare it to sew. First, similar to the dress collar, we want to take the ends and fold them in roughly 1/4 of an inch and then press. Next, we're going to fold it upwards and press that fold even all along the length. Then we'll be folding that last raw edge inwards and then folding the entire piece in half. Then you're going to want to top stitch along the length of the string. Just make sure when pressing that you'll be able to catch the underside of the string when top stitching across the apron. To keep things looking neat, rather than backstitching at the ends, I decided that I would tie off the threads and use a needle and stitch them back through the fabric, coming out between the seams before trimming them off. Then, the apron's all done. Lastly, we'll be doing the shoes. Now for the shoes, you're going to need both fabric and interfacing. For interfacing, I'm using this very lightweight, sheer, fusible type. Fusible just means that it has tiny little dots of glue on one side of the fabric so that when you iron it, it'll stick to whatever fabric you want to adhere it to. Now, it's a good idea to always use a scrap piece of fabric when working with interfacing so you don't get glue on your iron. Rather than go to the trouble of carefully cutting out the interfacing and lining it up on the bottom pieces of the shoe, I just cut out a square, laid my fabric pieces wrong side of the fabric to the glue side of the interfacing, covered it with my scrap fabric, and ironed. Then I just carefully peeled the interfacing off the scrap fabric. I probably should have trimmed it down a little bit more, but it worked out in the end. Just go slow when peeling it off because you don't want to rip the interfacing around the fabric. Then all you have to do is just trim around the fabric shoe piece. For the top of the shoe though, you will need to cut out all your pieces. Now for these, you're going to lay your pieces good sides together. This is the opposite of what you usually do with interfacing. You want the glue side to be facing outwards. You can tell the glue side because it'll be more textured. You can actually feel the little glue dots. The good side is softer. Now we're going to sew these pieces. I added a couple pins to hold it in place, and we're going to be sewing along the inner curve at roughly 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Again, walking your machine when needed. Once done, you'll be trimming the seam allowance down to about half to reduce bulk. Now we're going to flip the fabric and start pinning. I placed my first pin at the center notch to help hold things, but then I moved to the edge and will be starting here. As you work, you don't want to be able to see the interfacing from the outside or the fabric side of the shoe. So as you work, just slightly roll the fabric to the inside. This may mean that your interfacing will be a bit longer, but that's okay. Really, what we're looking for is just a millimeter over. Now this is going to take a little bit of time, but you'll end up with something like this. Now in pressing the shoe, it's a little bit tricky because you don't want to just press your iron on top. Because of all the pins, you won't be able to press it flat, and you may end up pressing wrinkles and bubbles into the fabric and interfacing. So I'm going to try and explain how I iron it using this paper as my pretend iron, the corner of the paper being the pointed tip of the iron. Now I cover it with my scrap fabric while I do this, but for the sake of you seeing what I'm doing, I'm going to uncover it and show you. I start off by working the tip between the pins so that the glue activates and sticks to the fabric, helping hold it in place. Then I remove 2 pins at a time, covering it back up and ironing that spot, removing another 2 pins, ironing, and repeating all the way around. Once done, I give it a good pressing with some steam to make sure the glue really sticks. Now we take the top and the bottom shoe pieces and place them good sides together, interfacing sides outwards. For the bottom part of the shoe, the wider part is the top. You want to match that center notch to the center notch of the top of the shoe and place a pin. Then start working your way along, pinning the edges together until you get close to the center back notch, and then repeat for the other side. Once done, you'll have something that looks like this. Now we're going to sew all the way around, starting and then finishing at the center back notch. You can see here that I removed a couple pins from the other side just to move it out of the way while I got started. You want your first stitch to be as close in line with that back notch as possible, and again, like everything else, we're using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. I walked my machine to sew the entire shoe. I would rather go slow than have to redo anything. Now here, I'm repinning the side that I had unpinned. To make it easy for yourself, try and do this when you reach the front notch. Also, I suggest making sure your needle is in the down position just so you don't accidentally move things. And you want your last stitch to again be as close in line with that notch as possible. Then you're going to lay the ends together and sew a straight line which should butt right up against the stitching you just finished. Then I tied the threads together so they didn't unravel and tucked away the ones at the top before snipping them all. Lastly, you want to trim the seam allowance down to about half. I decided they needed a little something extra, so I took these tiny ribbon flowers that I had and hand sewed them in place. You could also embroider or paint flowers on if you don't have anything like these. But once that's finished, you're done. I want to congratulate and thank anyone who made it through both videos. If you actually end up making this dress, I would really love to see it. You can tag me on Instagram. At the time of making this video, my Instagram's pretty empty, but it does exist, so I'll put a link to it in the description below. I hope you all enjoyed watching, and I'll see you next video. Bye!